Moira Weigel is a scholar and founding editor of Logic magazine. Originally trained in modern languages, including German and Mandarin Chinese, she now studies digital media in a global context. You might have heard of her first book, Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating, from 2016, which is about how modern dating co-evolved with consumer capitalism and other forms of gendered work. Her second book, co-edited with Ben Tarnoff, is Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it. It's based in interviews that Weigel and Tarnoff conducted with workers at every level of the Bay Area tech industry, from startup founders to cafeteria workers. Her current research focuses on transnational e-commerce entrepreneurs, and that's really our main focus here, since Moira recently published an incredible overview of Amazon's reach and global strength, a lengthy report that she titled Amazon's Trickle-Down Monopoly. What's interesting is that she acknowledges the fact that we might not be particularly keen to sit and theorize the impact of the restructuring of the retail business in the 21st century, but it's actually really important. What, we might ask, does Amazon's lack of accountability to the sellers that use it indicate in terms of the nature of platform capitalism? Weigel points out that businesses like Amazon are really governed algorithmically in a way that undermines their sellers' entrepreneurial autonomy. And yet, the way that Amazon often justifies its existence is by saying that it's a staunch ally of small business. Weigel unpacks this paradox by looking at what her interviewees say about negotiating the Amazon marketplace. The lack of accountability that Amazon enjoys, despite employing hundreds of thousands of people, expresses itself through, in part, these seemingly arbitrary decisions that the company makes. So things like banning accounts, restricting certain sellers, or constraining the flow of certain products. Those decisions are often experienced by sellers as mistakes, according to Weigel's research, but in her analysis they could be part of what she describes as a sort of regulatory risk shift, a means of both policing an increasingly complicated marketplace and navigating a complex regulatory environment. Making things circuitous benefits Amazon by keeping things opaque, and understanding the makeup of the company's power is similarly muddy. It was difficult for Moira to even do this research because of how hard it was to actually locate people to interview. That difficulty itself, she says, revealed something about the way that Amazon's monopoly is maintained. As she puts it, recruiting failures were an important finding. Nonetheless, the report she's put together came about as the result of building trust with sellers and realizing that people, if given the chance, wanted to talk about their experiences in the world of Amazon. And they had specific words for describing that world. They talked about the old times, the Wild West, and the jungle. These terms were ways for people to work through how they work in the system and to understand their participation in that system. The first question is really about your analysis of what you're calling Amazon's trickle-down monopoly, a report that adds to a rapid proliferation of critical texts that are trying to give us conceptual tools for understanding the scale of this company's dominance, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what's so important from my perspective and unique about your report is the fact that you're offering a deep qualitative analysis of, in particular, third-party sellers' experiences of navigating what you describe in the piece as a, quote, web of globally dispersed, constantly shifting systems that Amazon comprises.
Yeah.
So first of all, I just really appreciate the obvious time, rigor, empathy that clearly went into writing this account.
Thank you.
But I wanted to ask you about basically what drew you to the experiences of third-party sellers. What gave you the sense that they were sort of the main nodes in, to again quote you, this globally dispersed terrain that Amazon defines?
I had gotten interested in Amazon by a sort of circuitous route. I had been doing research on right-wing media and what folks talk about as disinformation, although I don't really love that term, and had done a project with some friends on right-wing and white nationalist publishing on Amazon. that led me to do a kind of deep dive into their CreateSpace self-publishing tools and sort of extremist books on the platform. And long story short, in the process of doing that research, which, I stand by, and I think we made some important findings, I also came to think that, no offense to my former self, if one is interested in power and exploitation and issues of gender, race, identity, these kinds of questions we'd been thinking about, the book publishing on Amazon is a pretty small piece of how Amazon shapes those things. Amazon has a much more significant material impact on different kinds of gendered, racialized, spatialized inequalities through its e-commerce and logistics and delivery. So all this to say, I got interested in Amazon through that project. In the past, with my Logic co-founder and life partner, Ben Tarnoff, I had actually not only with Ben, through Logic magazine, and then with Ben as part of a book, I'd done a lot of these anonymous oral histories with tech workers, people who worked at different technology companies. And so when I first started getting interested in Amazon's retail, which I should probably have said this up front, I think we tend not to think that much about retail because it's feminized or it seems sort of frivolous or, in any case, like buying pencils or diapers doesn't feel as high stakes, obviously, maybe as like fascist memes. I think we don't tend to think about Amazon retail that much, but of course it's the core of the business. It always has been. Got really interested in the retail business because I'd done these anonymous interviews with folks who worked at tech firms in the past. I thought, I'll start out by going through my networks to try to find some Amazonians who I can interview. I did some of that. I did speak to some Amazonians, but then quickly decided that wasn't the right approach for this project for at least two reasons. One was practical. Those folks are NDA'd. It's very hard to find them to talk to. Inevitably, the ones I can talk to, there's some kind of personal connection or political sympathy or something that leads them to talk to me. And so it's not really a random sample. But equally importantly, perhaps even more importantly, the engineers I spoke to, worked as engineers do on some very particular bounded like widget within the Amazon system. So an engineer, however brilliant, could explain to me, the one tool they worked on that, say, informed which search results showed up in which geographic region based on compliance requirements or whatever. But I realized that to get a more global view of the marketplace, I would need to turn to other people, and realized pretty quickly that the third-party sellers, who are the business owners who sell the majority of everything purchased through Amazon.com, and are sort of at the forefront of Amazon's platformization of retail, that they were the people I wanted to talk to, and they, in a way, had a much more global knowledge of how the system worked than an engineer did, right? Because their whole livelihood was hustling all the different aspects of this system. And then, of course, once in theory, although they were much harder to talk to than I anticipated, but in theory, I thought, okay, this is a population that can talk to me. They're not NDA'd by Amazon. And of course, the last thing I'll say, that was both seemed practical. It seemed like a richer knowledge base in a way to draw from than the narrow engineering expertise. And so that was really the insight that led me to want to focus on that population.
I mean, there's so much there, and it's really fascinating to hear you talk about the process of sort of intuiting where you wanted to go and then realizing how to refine your focus. But because you gestured to it, because I was fascinated by the research that you did for the Atlantic piece with Ava Kaufman and Francis Sang, I guess I wanted to ask you about that. Because this is an article where you point out that Amazon controls, even if it is only a small percentage of its empire, half the market for all books and close to 90% for ebooks.
Right.
And the article points out that Jeff Bezos himself made it clear that they want to make every book available, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But the dangerous thing about that is that in your research, you show Amazon's algorithms actually recommend fascist books.
Yeah.
There was, at the time of that article's publication, rampant white supremacy and fascism in much of its online archive. Do you have, like Amazon removed some things, I guess, after a ProPublica report, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of like what's been done there, or just you've kind of left that research behind?
Well, it's interesting that you ask this because they did. My memory is that article published in April 2020. And, we had been focused on white nationalist and extremist publishing, which we showed Amazon, provided a very important hosting and distribution infrastructure. Starting with the pandemic, Amazon also became a major site for the dissemination of various kinds of misleading information about COVID, anti-vax material, sort of QAnon material. So in a way, that problem just expanded. My impression of Amazon, both from my research on the books and my research on retail, is that like any platform, its sort of default is to let anyone post anything, and that it's like they'll take things down in a relatively capricious and opaque fashion based on complaints. I mean, I think it is an authentically hard problem how to moderate that self-publishing platform or book publishing platform. But at the same time, we were disturbed by the realization that, as I said, to the extent that Amazon was delivering these books through Prime, storing them in its warehouse in some cases, Amazon was really effectively subsidizing and providing the infrastructure for the distribution of these books. And so if previously, if I had wanted to get neo-Nazi material from a particular publisher, I would have had to send a postcard with a check to a mailbox in Nebraska. Now I could order it and have it in 2 days. Another thing that was interesting to me about that topic and remains interesting to me was also about how books, as these kinds of almost residual cultural forms in a digital environment, retained a certain kind of totemic authority, even if in reality a self-published book on Amazon is no different from a post on a website or a blog. I was interested in how the folks publishing and distributing those books sort of pointed to and invoked the form of a book, right? As giving them a certain kind of cultural authority and expertise. I can't even remember how much made it into the ProPublica piece, but Francis Tsang had scraped all this Reddit data and looked for places where people shared Amazon links on Reddit. And it was very interesting to us to see how in certain right-wing discussion spaces, people would sort of point to the existence of a book to prove their point. So anyway, there's sort of like a residual cultural authority in the book, even if in effect it's not really very different than a blog post.
Yeah, for sure. And what I get out of reading that is that like this kind of dark web of publishing, which is driven by the algorithm, people are kind of funneled into it, is a kind of world building in terms of like allowing white supremacists to imagine an ethno state, basically, and that there's a kind of Ben in his book Internet for the People talks about the issues with like just describing these things like echo chambers, filter bubbles, and so on. But there was like an odd echo chamber, it seems, developing within that specific site of publishing. In your essay or your report, this account of Amazon's trickle-down monopoly, one in which you're listening to people's stories in terms of, attempting to get, as you put it, a global use view of the marketplace. And I love that it is about like listening to people, like having to juggle care, labor, and this incredibly competitive business of third-party selling. And I guess I wanted to ask about how you conducted the interviews, your approach to that, because you mentioned you co-authored a book with Ben called Voices of the Valley that is doing the work of giving people within this rapidly changing digital economy an opportunity to kind of narrate their own experiences. I can see you talking about like gradually learning things through these interviews, narrating that. And I wondered if you could kind of speak to how you developed an effective way of opening up conversations and incrementally learning what people's experiences were, rather than just like asking them very pointedly, how you kind of tease that out. And if you could speak to what you call the value of lore and storytelling, and how you sort of just stayed attentive to the language that people use, building that trust as people recounted their experiences?
So when I started this research, I thought, my friend Francis Tseng, who'd worked on that ProPublica project with Ava Kaufman and me, I talked to Francis. Has computer science and quantitative skills that I don't have, about what I was doing. And Francis, initially I thought, okay, we'll scrape Amazon data that somehow has contact information for these businesses. I'll contact, 1,000 of them and hope that 50 are willing to talk to me or whatever it is. Francis used data that Amazon makes available called verified seller information to try to scrape contact information for sellers that I thought I could use for this purpose. In September 2020, we got something like 5,000 to 10,000 addresses and data points about these sellers. Amazon does not give phone numbers or emails. And to state the obvious, you can of course contact a seller through Amazon, but I didn't want to contact people through Amazon because the whole point was to keep them anonymous.
Sure.
And so anyway, I set out armed with this CSV file with some undergrad research assistants. I thought, okay, I'll find people to talk to. This very quickly realized this didn't work at all. We spent a couple weeks trying to connect those street addresses to phone numbers or email addresses, contacting people in both China and the United States. And I should say, about 50% by volume of third-party seller sales are from China directly to the U.S. marketplace. So about half of the people I was looking to interview were located physically in China, and we basically realized that data was not useful for anything, which initially I was really discouraged by. And at one point was so discouraged by that I thought, I'm going to have to give up on this project because I can't find anyone to talk to me. In a few weeks of spending most of our time trying to find people to talk to this way, I reached a grand total of one human being who, as soon as she figured out who I was on the phone, just said, no, I'm not interested in that. Thank you. And hung up. And initially, as I said, I was very discouraged by this, but realized that these recruiting failures were actually an important finding. And they taught me two things. One, or there were sort of two findings in there. One was that the data that Amazon provides is basically useless for anyone trying to get in touch with a seller outside of Amazon's channels, which I think in itself is actually kind of a significant finding. And I could elaborate on the ways in which it's useless, but you'll have things like dozens of businesses registered to one street address in Shenzhen, or businesses registered to something that's a PO box in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest in the US or something. But anyway, so that data is useless, and it's supposed to be, a source of transparency and accountability and so on. But I also realized that sellers are really secretive and really paranoid about talking to anyone. And everything I learned subsequently when I did manage to sort of enter this world bore that out. And there's sort of three reasons for that. One is that sellers are really frightened of Amazon. Most of them are almost completely dependent on Amazon for their businesses and their livelihood. They're really worried about irritating Amazon. Relatedly, because they do most of their business through Amazon and earn their livelihood through it, they don't really need the kind of outside attention that a startup founder or a brand selling through other channels might want. They sort of don't need anyone but Amazon. And finally, particularly for the sellers in the US, but really for everyone, their knowledge of how to source their products, usually outside the United States, that's sort of their whole thing. That's their whole edge. It's a very competitive marketplace. And so I can't tell you how many times someone I was interviewing was sort of skeptical or assumed that I was trying to get information for my own business or sort of spy on them or something. It was hard to find people to talk to that way. There really was a point at which I was like, oh God, I've done all this preparatory work and, cleared IRB review and everything for this project. And actually, it's just not going to be feasible because I can't find anyone to talk to me. I eventually did manage to sort of get to know a few folks who are gatekeepers in the Amazon seller community on the US, actually both the US and China side. I ended up using that strategy, and then through them to get personal introductions And then interestingly, perhaps this follows from the secrecy and sort of paranoia of the community. Once I had that, I often found that people really wanted to talk and like wanted to talk a lot about their experiences.
Sure.
And I think, I do like one of the probably the single thing that's made me happiest with the report is that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the seller community. And I think some people I spoke to at least actually appreciated the value of trying to get a global view of it and its history because it just isn't information that's been written down. And it's very overwhelming how fast it changes. So sorry, I've been talking for a long time and you were asking about interview technique and stuff.
Sure, if you want to speak to that. I mean, you've given me so much to think through already, but feel free. I mean, you're narrating it also in the report itself, right? Like
Right.
saying like the tactic of, for example, asking people for advice
Yeah.
on how they do what they do, rather than just like directly asking them like, "What's your business? How do you operate?" Right? Like
Right.
that was pretty crucial, it seems.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different aspects to it. So most of these, I want to say all of the interviews that I cite in the report, certainly most, and I think all were conducted remotely over
Hmm.
some kind of video chatting platform. I always laugh at myself because I got the fellowship that enabled me to begin this research. I think I found out I'd gotten it on February 19th, 2020. And I was like, great, I'm going to go to Guangdong. I'm going to like do all this research in China. And it was like, no, that I'm like go in person and observe things. And
Yeah,
obviously that
right.
didn't happen. I think, there's a part of me that, of course, would have loved to go to Shenzhen and like hang out in the businesses of some of the people I interviewed. In a way, though, I think it was appropriate to the topic that I did all these interviews remotely because all the people I spoke to were also living mostly through screens and their businesses are mostly conducted through screens. So it was sort of normal to them to be just talking through Zoom or Tencent meetings or whatever it was. Since I was conducting these remotely, I don't know, you establish different rapport with people in different ways. I think, I think small talk about the pandemic. I have little kids. I was actually pregnant when I was doing a lot of these interviews. And I feel like, I don't know if you could see on Zoom, but that would often somehow come up and people would have different ways of reacting or connecting to that. Or a lot of the moms I interviewed would sort of connect over being moms. So there's sort of a basic human connection element. I did find that, for instance, because people are so secretive, people tended to respond better to questions along the lines of like, what would you tell someone who's just starting out? Or what are the biggest mistakes people make? Rather than, asking them immediately who their suppliers are and what their advertising tactic
Hmm.
is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I could take that, and sort of go in two different directions. Like,
Yeah, wherever you want.
the big thing to me is obviously to think through kind of U.S.-China relations. Like, I know that in the report that you were studying in Beijing in 2011.
Yeah.
Around the time I think that Amazon was really struggling to establish a market in China.
Yeah.
Which like I'm super curious about that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about sort of how you developed a command of Mandarin and how that helped conduct these interviews. So maybe we'll get to that, but I guess I wanted to ask like just a sense of, because you've talked about this kind of logistics empire and some of it's gendered and racialized kinds of implications. One of the things that organizes your report is a series of metaphors that describe like the trajectory of Amazon's rise. There are these three key phrases that come out of the interviews that you kind of use to explain the epochs of
Yeah.
Amazon's history. There's the old times, the Wild West, and the jungle. And then actually you talk about like the rocket ship at a certain point at the end.
Yeah.
Can you describe just basically like what the sort of pivotal moments were for each of these distinct eras, just to give people a sense of
For
what's going on there?
sure. And that's reminding me that I didn't answer your question about lore. And the only thing I had written down what you were asking was I just said the word lore on my piece of paper
Nice.
in front of me.
Great word.
Yeah, I can't take credit for the word. I think it was Rigoberto Lara Guzman and Ranjit Singh, who are also at Data and Society. They still are, but when I was, they were two folks at Data and Society. we're working on this workshop called Parables of AI and thinking a lot about lore and parables and forms of storytelling about technical systems as a kind of knowledge about them. So I feel like I have to cite Rigo and Ranjit on that one. Yeah, so honestly, since as I've mentioned, it's such a complicated system, Amazon's third-party retail business. It's so elaborate, it's so global, and it really hasn't been written about in any kind of systemic way. Like there's advice literature and books about how to make $1 billion on Amazon or something, but those get outdated very quickly, and so on. I felt that for the first months of doing these interviews, I really was just trying to figure out what was going on. Like I was literally just trying to figure out in a lot of ways how the marketplace worked and how people navigated it. Over the course of those interviews, and I interviewed merchants who've been on it for different amounts of time, it started to strike me, and I guess social scientists would call this saturation or something, but it started to strike me that I was like hearing similar stories again and again, or there were certain parts of stories that were similar to one another. And I noticed that there were these turning points in the history of the marketplace that many different interviewees seem to all recognize and sort of have in their minds in common. And I also noticed that at least on the English-speaking side of things, there were these common phrases that people used to refer to them, these phrases of the old times, the Wild West, and the jungle. I realized after doing dozens of these interviews that, how to put it, that these terms themselves reflected elements of how the people I was interviewing understood the system and understood their place in the system that were salient. And again, the very fact that there were these fairly abrupt, and it seemed widely, if not universally recognized, breaks in between the time periods, that itself was a salient finding about how Amazon works and the way it sort of changes the game through new products and policies very abruptly at various times, and how that's part of how it makes sellers, both gives them opportunity, but also makes them extremely vulnerable to its shifting prerogatives. So the way old days, the old times, I only spoke to a few people who had sold during that time because it was a much smaller marketplace in that era. Folks generally use that phrase to refer to the time period before the late 2000 aughts, when Amazon basically just functioned like an online catalog, a bit more like Etsy, not Etsy, eBay. Well, maybe also Etsy, but a bit more like eBay, right, which of course was the original inspiration for the third-party marketplace. At that time, basically sellers could pay a fee to list their products on the site, and then when someone placed an order, Amazon would send them that person's name and address, and the seller would send it to them, and Amazon just handled the payment and the display. And then there was this second era that folks referred to as the Wild West, of really dramatic expansion and some chaos. But it took me a long time to sort of put together what the operative changes were. But it was clearly after Amazon created Prime, which it did in 2006, and then created a service they call Fulfillment by Amazon, FBA, for sellers, which meant that anyone who wanted to pay $39.99 or its 2010 equivalent could open a seller account and send in goods to Amazon warehouses to be sold. And what this meant in practice, I think in the report I talk about the first phase is like the catalog era. The second phase was opening up Amazon's physical infrastructure so that sellers could, and indeed basically are obligated to, for a variety of reasons, ship through Amazon's Prime services. In that way, they also sort of subsidized the growth of Amazon's fulfillment services, right? Because they're paying fees to use it. And then this last era, the jungle. And I think we're all kind of familiar with tech people talking about the Wild West. The jungle, I realized, it's funny, talking to Ranjit and Rigo, who I mentioned from Data and Society, they were encouraging me to riff on like, what's the jungle? How is the jungle different from the Wild West? Just like an image. Yeah. And they're both, neocolonial images of nation state and imperial expansion.
Right.
They're both imaginaries of like violence done to indigenous people and land and resources taken and so on. But the jungle is like darker and denser and thicker, and maybe you need a guide, right? It's like a different kind of imaginary space. I came to think the jungle refers to two things. First, it refers to the fact that the marketplace got a lot more complicated as it globalized, and a lot more dangerous in a certain respect, in that competitors all over the world could suddenly attack your listing. I think it also reflected the growing dominance of Amazon's own branding, right? Because it's like Amazon, the Amazon River, the jungle,
Sure.
and the growth in the mid to late 2010s of all these different kinds of services and courses and service providers promising to help sellers navigate Amazon, most of which tried to pick up, associate themselves with Amazon by using the branding. So there's a famous data company called Jungle Scout, and there are all kinds of bros on YouTube and now TikTok who will tell you about the law of the jungle and so on. And so I think in different ways it pointed to the growing density and complexity of Amazon's marketplace, and also of this social or parasocial world that surrounded it and brought people onto it. So I think also by kind of spending time with and thinking about these metaphors was part of what led me to this trickle-down monopoly concept that ended up governing the report. It kind of implies two contradictory things. One of which is that Amazon's marketplace is the land, right? If the Wild West is like a land rush where those who can, backed by the power of the state back east, like go and grab land from indigenous people and other people. In that metaphor, it's like the seller is going to grab their piece of Amazon, right? And then, but in another way, and the second sense of the Wild West or the jungle made a deep impression on me, because so much of what I talked to sellers about was navigating Amazon's bureaucracy and rules and like sort of opaque governance. In a second way, Amazon isn't the land, but rather the state that's sort of like sending the individual seller out to like source stuff for its marketplace, whether it's in a bargain bin in a Best Buy in Illinois or factories in Zhejiang province or whatever. And so that contradiction between seeing Amazon as the land that was their opportunity and then seeing Amazon as like the state that was sending them out as their agent, I came to think was actually quite interesting. On the one hand, they're sort of bossed around and often mistreated and exploited by Amazon in all kinds of ways. There's a new study out just a couple of days ago that shows that the average percentage of their revenues that sellers pay to Amazon is well over 50% of each sale, which to me is a shocking number. The previous study figure had been 34. It just goes up and up. So they know they're sort of bossed around and controlled and exploited, but also see it as a site of opportunity, and in some cases their best opportunity. And so I was interested in that ambivalence because I think that's the heart of what hegemony is, right? It's like people being invested in upholding the thing that exploits them. So anyway, sorry, that's a long answer, but that's part of what interested me about these terms that kept surfacing in the interviews, at least with the English speakers.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely right to kind of conceive of Amazon as like a hegemon. I know, Ben writes in Internet for the People about these platforms as more like sovereigns, like operating like sovereigns.
Yeah.
And like this is, but you're like mining that ambivalence. And I think like this is the thing, despite there being, it seems, a diminished ability now in the jungle for sellers to succeed within the marketplace, like your report notes that in 2021, there were more than 6 million unique sellers active on Amazon, and that nearly 2,000 new sellers open accounts every day.
Yeah, I think it's nearly 4,000 actually. It's like 3,700. Wow. All those numbers, like with a grain of salt, because it's always hard to know those numbers. But yeah,
Sure.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and so like this overwhelming number of people are also being forced to become, as you put it, Amazon's agents.
Yeah.
And so there's like, it's that give and take where you have opportunity, but you also, it comes with a compromise of like your autonomy being eroded as you have to become like a little Amazon, basically, to use your phrase. And so like what's interesting to me, and you kind of gestured to it in terms of the bureaucracy, is that like there's a part where you note that the sellers often focused on Amazon's failures to properly govern its platform.
Yeah.
But like in your analysis, Amazon is governing its platform very calculatedly, like in a way
Right.
that is always appropriate to its interests. And
Right.
so like how much of the trickle down monopoly is built on a model of constantly moving things around, altering the rules of the game to maintain dominance? And does this kind of relate to this idea that you offer, that actually centralization and decentralization are not opposites, but kind of
Yeah.
paired?
I think so. I think you're pointing towards a few important things. And it's funny, I'm actually trying to write an academic paper now that's related to something you asked. And I'm still sort of like wrestling with this idea. So I often heard one of the findings or learnings that was most surprising to me when I started talking to sellers, and now I just take utterly for granted, is about how glitchy the platform is, or how often people were suspended for reasons that made no sense. I mean, really no sense. And what shocked me initially about hearing this, because I think a lot of us have heard in some of the popular antitrust discourse about Amazon, like copying products and that kind of mistreatment.
Mm-hmm.
But what shocked me was I thought, like this should be against Amazon's interest too. If they suspend, I mean, actually, I'm continuing to do research in this area. And just last week, I was dealing with a company that has lost over $1.5 million in the months since Amazon suspended one of its top products for reasons that nobody can explain. Like and anyway, I won't bore you with the details, but it's like the two Amazon teams in charge of this don't talk to each other. The product has been flagged by some NLP algorithm that for some wrong reason, and so on. And so anyway, when I initially started hearing about this kind of thing, I thought like, well, that doesn't make any sense because Amazon's losing its 55% or whatever cut of
Sure.
every sale. But I think when I spoke to sellers experience these governance phenomena, let's call them, as mistakes, as like errors or glitches.
Yeah.
Over time, and that makes quite a lot of sense. And interestingly, I'd say, I think that sellers express to me much more sort of moral outrage or frustration over this kind of thing than over the copying products, which they would sort of took for granted as something that could happen. But when I think about it from Amazon's perspective, these glitches may be rational within its sort of global calculus, right? And so to take the example of the ceiling fans that the person can't sell because they've been suspended for making an antibacterial health claim or something, which is a true story. And it's someone who lost over $1 million while waiting to reach a human who could help clarify that.
Yeah.
From the seller's perspective, that makes no sense. It's like the ceiling fan is not a medicine. Like, why would that happen? That makes no sense. From Amazon's perspective, facing new EPA, Environmental Protection Agency rules about pesticides, and new pressure around health claims during COVID, it might be a perfectly rational decision to over optimize, to suspend everyone who might have something to do with that, to sort of overfit the algorithmic suspension of those people if it prevents a government lawsuit or more intense regulation and so on. And so I think that this phrase isn't catchy at all because every time I use it, the person I'm talking to is like, what? But I've started thinking of this as a kind of regulatory risk shift where I'm like, Amazon passes on the risk of regulation to the sellers in a way by over regulating them around particular things at the same time that they fail to regulate around other things. But I think the core issue that it highlights is Amazon, and this is common to platforms. We might even say this is what a platform is, but is Amazon's lack of any kind of accountability to the sellers who use it. And sellers sign business agreements that forego many kinds of redress against Amazon in the case of wrongdoing. Amazon can just hold their funds in a lot of, because Amazon holds all their money for them and usually pays out on every 2-week basis. Amazon can seize their funds. It has all their inventory. And so I think what these kind of little stories at the local level, the bigger issue they point to is Amazon's incredible market power. And I think that deep powerlessness of even a quite large company. I mean, some of the companies I interviewed made tens of millions of dollars in revenue a year, which is fairly big. But even a pretty large player or someone, I would interview thinking like, this person makes more money than I do. Like this isn't isn't an impoverished victim or something,
Hmm.
are very vulnerable to Amazon and to these business agreements that really mean they kind of have to take what the platform gives them.
Yeah, they become little Amazons, but as you point out, they lack the capital, and capital in the sense of a control of wealth, a marshaling of an entire chain of command of supply. And yeah, I mean, like this kind of policing through glitchiness, over optimization. It's like fascinating to try and think through it. But the thing that grounds the report is the lived experience of people within this network. And so, like, in terms of like just sort of building off of what you were saying about the administrative rationality of Amazon, like it is the case that there are these problems that need to be like addressed. For example, people buying reviews becoming
Yeah.
normative, right? Just like what everybody does. And Amazon is faced with the challenge of having to police that practice. And it does
Mhm.
it in a way that is such a kind of brute crackdown method of just
Mhm.
like, you know, like in May 2021, I guess they exposed 200,000 accounts engaged in a fake review ring. And
Yeah.
the way that it polices it is to just like ban everybody, right?
Yeah, they banned 70. There was a data breach that exposed there were 200,000 participants in the fake review ring. So some of those were
Mm.
sellers and some of them were the people they were buying fake reviews from. And Amazon just summarily suspended 75,000 seller accounts in China overnight. And they ultimately permanently banned, I think, 6,000 of them. There were actually a
Mhm.
small group of electronics companies hit in that ban. We're suing Amazon to try to get their money back, that because Amazon has their their revenues. But I
Mhm.
don't know what came of that lawsuit. But yeah, anyway, that's the thing. I just was going to say that was the ban I think you're thinking of.
Maybe that's a good way of kind of moving into discussion of how Amazon stands at a really in an important position in terms of like determining to some extent relationships between the United States and China. I mean, eventually Amazon achieves expansion into China, but only really after the 2008 financial crisis, you say. That's the turning point where, China creates 132 pilot zones for cross-border e-commerce where it had been resistant before that crisis. Um, so like in the end, you're talking about how these three figures, in some ways, are certainly like nationalistic framings, and there are
Yeah.
obviously like certain psychic assumptions, internalized xenophobia, kind of baked into this choice of metaphors. I'm curious about that because you also note that the racist terms with which U.S. sellers describe the problems of the jungle and having to compete with China. So like you mentioned Donald Trump a few times in the report, but there isn't an explicit engagement with like racism and nationalism really until the appendix. And in the
Mm.
appendix, you mentioned that your current research is looking at how Amazon mediates race and gender relations. Given how now we're regularly talking about strained US China relations, I was hoping you could kind of elaborate on that work and some of the challenges of doing that work now.
So Amazon tried to enter the Chinese marketplace with their acquisition of a Chinese e-commerce firm called Joyo in the 2000 odds. I'm going to say 2009, although I should fact check that. Maybe it was 2004, and then they rebranded it in 2009.
Mhm.
Amazon basically over the course of the 2010s, when I used to see Amazon bikes in the apartment complex I lived in Beijing, uh, tried and failed to become an e-commerce company within China that Chinese people would use to shop from. Sort of failed to compete with Alibaba and Pinduoduo and Taobao and the other big Chinese e-commerce marketplaces. Uh,
Mhm.
by so here's the timeline in the mid 2015, excuse me, mid 2010s. By 2015, whether or not they don't fully pull out having a Chinese marketplace until 2019. You can still buy stuff from Amazon.cn. It's like a very small less than 1% of the Chinese e-commerce marketplace in China. But by the mid-2010s, Amazon realized something which other e-commerce companies like AliExpress, the Alibaba subsidiary, and Wish.com had already realized, which is that if you could use your platform to become a kind of portal from Chinese manufacturers directly to American consumers, cutting out middlemen who had mediated that before, you could offer consumers really cheap products. And so in 2015, Amazon made this choice to open its marketplace directly to sellers with Chinese IP addresses, and then began a very active recruitment effort, which is ongoing, to bring Chinese merchants onto the platform, and indeed also collaborated with many Chinese cities and provinces to host conferences and trainings and so on. And that's sort of the beginning of the rise of what we might call Amazon in China, but it's just important to understand that when we say Amazon in China, we don't mean Chinese consumers. We mean a kind of like portal from the factory or small capitalist who owns several factories or sourcing companies or whatever in China to the US marketplace. There's a notorious memo that some Amazon exec wrote in 2015, basically acknowledging, and this was reported in Brad Stone's book, Amazon Unbound, but also people in the community have talked about it to me. There's a notorious memo where an Amazon exec basically acknowledges that doing this is going to totally destroy a bunch of US Amazon businesses, particularly retail, apparel businesses, and electronics businesses and so on. And he sort of says, but we have to do it to bring down our prices. And again, I think sort of segue a bit to the race and Sinophobia and new Cold War questions. I have to confess, I feel some sort of normative ambivalence around all of it because, I've interviewed a bunch of Chinese merchants at this point, and why shouldn't, the factory that makes the coats that sell well on Amazon in Suzhou, why shouldn't they capture more of the value of those coats that they make? I don't know. That bit is sort of complicated, but it's certainly true. There's sort of two big points I want to make and that I'm thinking about in further research since the report. One is that I think we tend to think of the entrepreneur or entrepreneurship or small business as if it's somehow separate from politics or an alternative to corporate bureaucracy and just like the heroic individual. But of course, entrepreneurship is a state project. Entrepreneurs are backed by low interest rate state-backed loans. They're often given certain tax breaks and incentives and in some cases even direct subsidies. And there are various policies that states make to encourage small businesses and entrepreneurship. It so happens that is true in China as it is here in the United States, even if it's maybe not quite the same kind of religion as small business is in the United States. And so Amazon often speaks publicly, and small business in the US also has this particular history with the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement and Black capitalism, and sort of this idea that small business, and there's also this idea of ethnic capital, that sort of immigrants and historically marginalized, racialized communities and women who maybe would have faced prejudice and discrimination in a corporate world, can start small businesses. That's like a big part of our national religion in a certain way. And so I think that's why Amazon, particularly in the past few years, as it's come under criticism for its monopoly or quasi-monopolistic power, has often invoked this image of the small business and of themselves as the allies of small business. And part of the way I want to push back or qualify or bring some reality to those claims is not just by saying, well, yes, but these businesses are governed algorithmically in a way that really undermines their entrepreneurial autonomy or means they don't have the kind of freedom that we associate with small business. But the other way is that I want to say, half the small businesses, as I've said, are in China. Amazon never talks about that. And indeed, I know they get very upset when other people talk about that. Which again, I'm not saying there's anything bad about that on its face, and it's really, if we want to historicize it, right? I think in general, like most things Amazon does, someone else did before. Most things Amazon does, Walmart did before. Walmart went
Yeah.
to China in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, established extensive contacts with factories on the ground. So Amazon just sort of added this extra platformization dimension that now they don't even need the
Hmm.
sourcing office in Shenzhen, right? They'll just get the merchants right onto the platform. Walmart now, of course, is imitating that with their own third-party platform. But it's not that any of this is utterly unprecedented. I think it's just that when Amazon talks about small business, I sort of want to remind people that it's like, yeah, and what we're talking about is like the next step of what what Walmart did, reorganizing global supply chains, not necessarily like
Hmm.
a mom and pop on the corner of Main Street or whatever. But
Hmm.
Amazon invokes that mom and pop imaginary often and strategically.
Yeah, and misleadingly. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, if I can ask one more,
Sure.
there's this sense in the report of the kind of, pivotal place of crisis, the kind of, productive kind of work of crisis in a sense.
Yeah.
If you could sort of share your sense of the composition of a system where companies can benefit from crisis in this way. I mean, you're partly
Mm.
trying to critique the system using, for example, Kianga Yamada Taylor's notion of predatory inclusion. Um, but you're also sort of like bringing that into conversation with a growing global antitrust movement that
Mhm.
tries to make apparent the kind of predatory nature of Amazon's monopoly power. So,
Mhm.
like you cite the 2020 report of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on
Mhm.
Competition and Digital Markets, where it acknowledges the thing that sellers have come to expect and basically accept these anti-competitive behaviors, this self-preferencing.
Mhm.
Can you sort of imagine a pathway to achieving the kind of antitrust action that would restore some degree of fairness to the system? I mean, it can't just be a boycott, right? Like, I don't know if you shop on Amazon. I'm guessing you don't.
No, I do. I do sometimes. I do
Oh,
sometimes.
okay, okay.
There's no excuse for it. There's no excuse for it. I do.
But like, so a boycott just won't work. So, what is that? What does that pathway look like? Do you have a sense of how exposing the, as it were, like predatory nature of preying on crisis
Yeah.
can do some of this kind of political work?
To answer the first part of your question, I think moments of crisis have been central to Amazon's growth. There was the moment in 2008 of the financial crisis and after that led a lot of sellers to seek either a replacement for lost income or supplemental income by selling through the platform. I won't go into the nitty gritty, although it's fascinating to me, but the sort of crisis of brick and mortar retail and of big box stores has also been indirectly part, the so-called retail apocalypse has also been part
Hmm.
of the Amazon story to the extent that in the Wild West era, those stores became an important sourcing site where sellers would go buy stuff at, the closing Target outside St. Louis and send it to Amazon to be sold to consumers elsewhere. And then, of course, COVID was this moment of rapid growth in 2020 and 2021, although it stopped in 2022 for Amazon and was widely perceived as accelerating the development of e-commerce. I think there's a lot to say to qualify that. I also should say I've started to actually really question whether e-commerce is even a meaningful category anymore because basically every brick and mortar store has an e-commerce element to it. And,
Right.
my random independent coffee shop or, the Lebanese store restaurant where I order lunch sometimes like has an app, has a website where I can order through an app. So I've started to wonder about the extent to which these things can even be separated anymore.
Hmm.
But anyway, COVID was thought of or perceived by Wall Street and by various other people, and for a time was a kind of spur to great growth on the China side. Without getting into the weeds, I think state support for overseas e-commerce or what they call cross-border e-commerce was motivated after 2008 by this need to sort of reinvent the entrepreneurial economy. So yeah, it's a company that grows as capitalism does in general through crisis. In terms of antitrust, I don't know. It seemed like there
Hmm.
was a moment a few years ago, maybe a year or so ago, where there was all this political momentum around antitrust in the United States. And in China, there was some antitrust action against Alibaba. For instance, EU regulators have imposed some fines, UK regulators, and taken certain steps against Amazon. But it doesn't seem to me that there's the same momentum and political possibility around that now. Although maybe I'm wrong. The FTC, which is headed by Lena Khan, who became academic famous for her article on Amazon's monopoly, is certainly sending some signals about aggressive antitrust. And Biden last month in January wrote this editorial in the Wall Street Journal calling on Democrats and Republicans to collaborate on antitrust legislation. So I don't know politically what seems most likely to happen in that arena in the next little while. I have to say, I also don't know how immediately it would benefit the people I wrote about. I think
Right.
it's not glamorous. It's not glamorous to say, or it's not maybe intellectually exciting, but I feel as if so much of what I heard about, the core thing that would make the lives of the sellers better would be like better customer support or seller support and like clearer policies. In the long run, they certainly, almost everyone I talked to was trying to diversify and sell more on other platforms and was worried about their dependency on Amazon. So I think if Amazon could become a smaller percentage of the e-commerce marketplace, that would make almost everyone I talked to, if not every single person, happy. But I think in the shorter term, the real problem that folks confronted every day was this just total lack of responsibility or accountability to their sellers. So I almost wonder if, in addition to or as a complement to antitrust initiatives, there's not a need for more sort of algorithmic impact assessment or oversight of how Amazon governs the marketplace. And I don't know how it would be done, but a need to impose some greater responsibility on Amazon in terms of how it treats the sellers, that it's like you can't suspend someone and while they lose $1 million without explaining to them what's going wrong. I'll say one thing that is a little bit more exciting or galvanizing maybe. One phenomenon I learned about and I've heard more about over the course of doing the research are sellers forming these collectives or cooperatives in a couple places in the United States, at least, in the hopes of gaining a little more bargaining power with Amazon, or having a better chance of getting the attention of someone in seller support who could help them or whatever it might be. I think the sort of pie in the sky thing that I can't help but think about when I see those groups forming is, what if those cooperatives were able to get bigger and more organized and somehow recognize what they have in common with like the Amazon unionization efforts or labor movement efforts around the company? To be honest, I think that's that's a long-term or sort of pie in the sky thought. The politics of small business people are not always so friendly to the politics of labor. But that certainly is one other kind of inkling or takeaway from the research in terms of what could be done.
This is like invaluable research that you've done. I really feel like...
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your enthusiasm.
I just think it'll contribute to the effort that you're, this kind of long-term effort, the narrative-driven kind of empathetic approach that you take, which also offers, like, as I think you rightly say, a kind of unprecedentedly systemic view of how people exist and try to subsist within this network. So thanks so much for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you.